wanted to share with you a very, I think, important idea from Rav Aaron Lichtenstein. I like revealing my sources, so I can tell you that this book, By His Light, is phenomenal. It wasn't actually written by him, but based on addresses and lectures by him. So although Rav Lichtenstein sometimes writes in a complicated English that's sometimes hard to understand, this is much more readable and a phenomenal book. It's just how you should look at the world. There's much to be gained from it, and I think additionally all of the essays that are in this book are now available on the Gush's website, the virtual Beit Midrash. So it's free too if you're willing to look at it from a computer screen. You can print it out. So I wanted to talk first of all about the holiday that's coming up, Shavuos.
What?
Shavuos
I'm paying attention here.
Shavuos is very often seen as part 2 of Pesach, and from at its core, it's because in the Torah we're told that the holiday is actually, its dating is not given to us in the Torah. It's based off of Pesach, that you count starting after Pesach. You count a certain amount of days till you get the Chag Shavuos, and from there, that's really where we develop this whole idea that Shavuos is really part 2 of the holiday of Pesach. So it seems at first that Shavuos is kind of the end goal, right? That what everything that's being accomplished, Matan Torah per se, that getting the law and the way we're supposed to live our lives. Don't worry, this isn't a Shavuos year. Right? It'll come back to Pesach, but it seems like Shavuos is really the end goal, and that Pesach is just the means to it. And if that's the case, it gets a little bit harder to understand why we celebrate Pesach in and of itself. But that's in a very abstract form. So we could celebrate steps. It's not a big deal. But when we talk about Pesach being the holiday of freedom, Zman Cherusenu, so what happens when we get to Har Sinai? We get all these laws. Which is beautiful. We love the Torah and everything, but it's in many ways it's a book of laws. And in that sense, I think one could argue, definitely feel certainly in these weeks, as you're getting ready for Pesach and you're turning your house upside down, cleaning, preparing food, buying different things, that you might not feel so free. That's something I'm personally feeling, that there is a lot of things that I have to do that are being imposed on me, and that's a word that maybe we're afraid to use, but that's actually what it is. This is an obligation. I have a chiyuv to make sure there's no chametz in my house, that I have everything set for a seder. I have obligations. I have things that are being placed on me, when say against my will. We have to get into that, but it's definitely not something that I'm necessarily making out of my own free choice. And that being focused on, in a small aspect with regards to preparing for Pesach, but also you could argue as a whole that is what the Torah system is. That's what halacha demands of us. So if that's the case, and not just about in terms of how I celebrate a holiday of freedom, but how is a Jew supposed to understand the concept of freedom in light of the fact that it seems like it's just a stop on the road to eventually becoming, instead of slaves to Paro, slaves to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right? If that's the case, and we're understanding it correctly, it sounds like freedom is, first of all, just a means to an end of being enslaved to Hashem instead, and that more than that freedom is it's just a step on the way. It's not really meant to be celebrated in and of itself. So that's obviously not true, right? Because we have this holiday of Pesach, we do celebrate it, and we call it Zman Cherusenu. That's what Chazal told us to view this holiday as being a celebration of. And you could argue, and this is the first source, the only one that's actually numbered on the sheet. My apologies. There's a Mishnah in Avos that actually quotes a pasuk that was in 2 parshios ago, Kisisa, referring to the luchos, referring to the Aseres HaDibros that's on those luchos. Says Charus al haluchos. That's what the way it's expressed in the pasuk, that it is the words were engraved into the tablets. And the Mishnah says, Al tikra charus ela cherus. Don't read it as charus, but instead Cherus has freedom, instead of engraved, freedom. Now obviously when we say that, that's a Talmudic mechanism that doesn't mean actually take the Torah and revowelize it, that in Shul you're going to read it differently, but that the Torah was written in a way in which the words were sometimes spelled in certain ways by which they could be revowelized. Not that we should actually do that, but that we should be able to delve meaning from alternate pronunciations. So we're saying here that the Torah could be understood, this pasuk could be understood to mean that there is cherus, there is freedom in the luchos. Right? She'ein lecha ben chor, and the Mishnah continues, there is no one that's truly free, ela mi she'osek b'talmud Torah, except for he that is actually engaged in Torah study. So, just, what do we think that might mean? Before we go further.
We have freedom from the slavery in Egypt, where so slavery was imposed upon us. We couldn't do it, and we're taking out the freedom. But freedom is not just the ability freedom implies free will, but free will to occupy oneself in a correct fashion, right, in an appropriate fashion, right. So it's not just, so freedom implies freedom to take on responsibilities and carry out those responsibilities in a fashion, in one's own fashion. Right? So there's that's the way I see it.
Is it to take our responsibilities based on our own initiative?
Based on our own initiatives.
But
so it's an aspect of free will to it, right?
But I mean, there's a lot that God's telling me to do that has nothing to do with my initiative.
Right.
So I think that's the tension here.
So I think you can't really have true freedom, because then you have chaos if you don't have laws and the Torah with it. So I think that's what it's talking about.
I understand. Like we claim, I think we live in a free society. We would call it. At the same time, there are laws, and right, we understand. We're beyond that. I guess babyish thing. I don't know if they do this in Canada. Maybe it's an American thing. That when my brother punches me, and I say, "Hey, what'd you do that for?" and he says, "Hey, it's a free country." Right? Do you have that here?
Sometimes do that. That's only people who watch American television. But we have the freedom to take on responsibilities and organize ourselves into society, right? So, I mean, here he's talking a little bit about from an individualistic standpoint with Torah study. But Torah study leads to an organized society, right? And man's relationship with man. So really, it's taking on the relationship, the freedom to improve, develop and improve one's relationship with one's fellow man, together with one's relationship with God. Right?
So that's an important distinction, because when we talk about man and fellow man, I understand that the society we live in has laws, and that's meant to keep us on a certain degree of control and order. And that's why my brother really shouldn't be able to punch me, in light of the fact that it's a free country. But we get that. But then when you talk about things that are Beit Lamakom, and some things that are Beit Lamachavero as well, there are things that go beyond what a secular society would demand of us. And so those are things that are at least going beyond our rational understanding.
Right.
We're going to get to that distinction soon, but we have to acknowledge that the Torah does impose those things on us as well.
And I see that more the connection here is that it's not just an absence of things, that you have to be an active participant. You have to be doing something actively about this freedom that you've achieved, that you've attained. If you ignore it, if you treat it lightly as you have that free choice, you have it, but you have to actually do something with it. You have to be activating that in some way, to be conscious of it and to be activating it. And obviously the preferred method, the preferred direction is that you activate and in that direction. The Torah study is going to make you yashar, is going to make you actually appreciate much more the freedom and give you mitzvot that actually activate.
For sure. I mean, inactivity, let's say, I think is really just another way of putting slavery as well. The way I've heard it is, if a person says, I'm free, I'm going to stay in bed all day, I'm not going to get up, right? And that person does stay in bed all day, we wouldn't say that they're free as much as we would say they're a slave to sleep.
What percentage of the population actually votes in national elections, okay, compared to provincial elections, compared to municipal elections? And it's been steadily dropping. It used to be, in Australia they have it's mandatory. You have to vote. You're fined if you don't vote. So of course it's 100% turnout. They used to have the same thing in Albania, but that was for a different reason. And but it's been dropping. So even having this tremendous opportunity that you have to exercise your choice in leadership has been dropping from an 80% down to about 62%, even in the U.S., where you had this really major clash of choice, right, of two different value systems, and yet it's been steadily dropping the percentage of people who actually,
just over half, I think,
maybe
voted
something like
this
that. I mean, and it's even worse when you talk at the state or provincial level or municipal level. It's like 30%. I mean, or go down to university student councils or high school student councils, and the people who bother to exercise these privileges that they have, right, that people fought for, died for, right? So
there's definitely a component of you have to do something with freedom is in some ways we would say is a neutral, okay, now what kind of feeling, and if you don't channel that into something, we're severely lacking. But
you're getting to what I think is sort of from an internal standpoint, internal slavery within an individual, internal freedom. So is one a slave to some of the lower levels of human desires and emotions, or does one conquer those and really go into the stage of freedom and elevate oneself up above those? So Torah study is one way of doing it.
Right, so that's the thing. And I think you could end there, and that's a sheer that people would give and say, I have to do something with this, right? But at the same time, we have to acknowledge Torah is one way of getting there. Let's say I'm talking about somebody that's really serious, and when they say, I want to have a life of fulfillment, but they don't see, Torah and halakhic observance, whatever it is that we do, that they don't see that as being their path. So if we just say freedom is about, well, we're not imposing anything on you, and you do something productive, do something constructive, and you're free to do whatever you want, so then a person might reach their very different conclusions. The fact that we've bought into this system, so on the one hand we've made a free choice to do so, but we had I guess so to speak, but we had Bechira with Paro too. I mean, it might have been a little bit different. If you tried to escape, you might be killed, right? That was the reality. But in the same, not in the same way, but to some extent, you could argue, I'm free within this lifestyle to do whatever I want, but there will be consequences in the world to come, whatever it may be in this world, and you're bound by those.
Right.
So these are things that are restricting us, that are imposing their implications on us in one way or another. And if we're going to pick, one way of life over another, so feel free to come in if you'd like. Not too late. So if we're talking, right. So I'm a serious person, let's say, and I want to lead a life of fulfillment. But why is it necessarily that this is going to be the way to do it? And the fact that is the way to do it, at least that's what we believe. So why isn't that something that is that's restricting me? Maybe it is. And how do I understand that in light of freedom and how I celebrate it? I just want to bring the point home a little bit more to show that this is a Jewish value. And if you do in fact want to have an idea of, and this is what Rav Lichtenstein says is a crucial element of the identity of a Jew, it's that of being a matzuvah, of being somebody that is commanded. If you look at the third source, we're going to skip the second for a moment. So we just have Amar Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Chanina said, Rabbi Chanina first of all was blind. That's something important to keep in mind. It says, not Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Chanina was not blind, and he says the following: Gadol mitzvah va'oseh mimisha eino mitzvah va'oseh. Greater is he who is commanded and fulfills that command, greater than one who is not commanded and fulfills it anyway, somebody that's a volunteer. Rav Yosef was the one that was blind. He says, Mireish hava amina, originally I would have thought that man dahava amar li halakha Rabbi Yehuda. If somebody was to tell me that the law follows Rabbi Yehuda, the amar suma pater min hamitzvos, Rabbi Yehuda felt that people that were blind were exempt from mitzvah observance. Okay, this was a debate that had taken place back then, so Rav Yosef was thinking, if the law followed Rabbi Yehuda, and that would make me, Rav Yosef, somebody that is exempt from mitzvahs, I would have made a party for the rabbis. I would have celebrated. Why? Because I'm not commanded, and look, I do it anyways. I'm a volunteer. That's great. I'm doing this altruistically. I'm doing it from my own self-motivation. But once I heard Rabbi Chanina's words that we just quoted earlier, this is Gadol Mitzvah Va'osa Yoser Mimi She'eno Mitzvah Va'osa, that greater is he who is commanded and does it than somebody who is not commanded and does it. So now Adarabba, now the opposite, Manda Amar Li De'en Alacha Rabbi Yehuda. If someone said, tell me the law does not follow Rabbi Yehuda, but it follows the other sages, that the blind are in fact obligated in mitzvahs, Avin the Yom HaTavel Rabbanan, and then I'll make a party for the rabbis, because then that means I'm doing it and I'm obligated. And the halacha actually does follow the majority opinion, the rabbis, and the blind are in fact obligated in mitzvahs. So Rabbi Yosef has what to celebrate. He's doing the mitzvahs, he's obligated in them. And what you see from this source really, I think, shows the centrality of a life of command, of being a mitzvah. This is something that we view as very, very much a part of our identity. If you wanted to define what is an observant Jew, I think it's somebody that really follows that calling of feeling like they are a mitzvah. So that just brings the point home even more. If that is in fact a part of my identity, then how do I relate to the notion of being free? And basically, what we would say is a Jew. This Jew that's celebrating freedom somehow on Pesach is somebody who is submitting himself, it seems like, to being a mitzvah, being somebody who's not doing mitzvahs out of, like Rav Yosef thought he was originally, I'm a self-motivated volunteer, and I'm doing this altruistically. Right? That's what Rav Yosef thought might have been the better way to go at first. It sounds like the Gemara's conclusion, we're not going to get into why this is the case, but the Gemara's conclusion is no, it's better to be commanded that you have to do something, that you have to be a mitzvah, you have to be obligated, and then to do it anyways. That's the greater reward. As it sounds like the more denial of self that's involved, the greater the reward is, which seems to go, I think, squarely against the concept of freedom, at least at first glance. Where the makor that I think really is the most stark is another Mishnah Avos. Go back one source. It says, Hu haya omer, this is referring to Rabbi Gamliel, who was talking in the previous Mishnayos in Avos. He says, Asei ritzono keritzonacha. Make your will into God's will. Kadesh yasa ritzonacha keritzono. So that your will be done like His will. Now, what does that essentially mean, though?
Do His will.
God will do things for me if I align what I want exactly with what He wants.
It doesn't seem like free will.
It doesn't seem like He's doing what I want really at all. Right? If say to a person, if I really want you to give me $500, if you want to give me $500 too, then I'll do your will, right? That's what it sounds like. At first, really nullify yourself, and the next sentence says that explicitly. But tell ritzono mipnei ritzono, nullify your will before His will, before God's will. Kadesh yavata ritzon acherim mipnei ritzonacha, in order that the will of others, the other individuals, shall be nullified for your will. Right? So here there's maybe a little bit more that if I align myself with God's will, if I want what God wants, right? So then other people that might get in the way of me in my life, of accomplishing those goals, so God will stop them. I mean, but that's really God fulfilling His will. Then it sounds like really, when you align yourself entirely with what God wants, great, God will do for you what you want. Right? What you want is really apparently what God wants at that point. It's not really about you. That's what it sounds like from these sources, and it's just that there's plenty of more that you could bring that support this notion that really the guiding force of what establishes the identity of a Jew is to be a mitzvah, of being somebody that views himself as commanded and being essentially a slave to God. So then how exactly does that fit with the concept of freedom?
Because we chose. The choice we make.
So there's bechira chafshus. That's that I have free will to do this. So that's true to extent. We talked about that a little bit earlier, right? I don't have to do the mitzvahs if I don't want to. No problem. If I choose not to observe the mitzvahs, so okay. The problem is, in the Torah system, it might be very nice, and you can choose to not do the mitzvahs, but there are consequences to that. Right. And you're bound to those consequences whether you want to be or not. You can't say, I'm going to eat pork and I'm going to go to heaven anyways. It's not going to work that way, right? We are bound to those consequences. So even though free choice will allow us in terms of practice to do whatever it is that we want, right? At the same time, we are bound, at least in the consequences of our actions, if not in terms of what we actually do. So now I have 3 sources. All of them are in English because none of them were originally written in Hebrew. You have the Rambam Shmona Prakim written in Arabic. I apologize if anybody wanted the original Arabic. Rav Lichtenstein is the next. He actually wrote this originally in English, and then after that something from Peasch, written originally in German.
He's having his 90th birthday.
Yes, Rav Lichtenstein's 80th birthday is this year,
and there's something going on for it.
The Kollel, the YU Kollel, is also down south running a program competing with mine.
Yes,
also with Rav Lichtenstein's talk.
Right.
It's okay.
Where? At Fratton Park or where?
It's I don't know, somewhere. I think Epanate.
They're showing a movie or something, or?
They're showing a movie at. Why am I drawing a blank? At Orchaim, I think, is where they're doing it.
Oh, they shouldn't.
Don't worry about
well,
that.
what you said about Hirsch is very funny because Hirsch wrote in German, obviously, and then his papers on the Chumash was in the English one came out first, then the Hebrew one. So I heard someone say they didn't know about that, so they said, "Oh, you have to read it in the original." They didn't know that.
They didn't know it was originally written in German to begin with. Funny. Okay, so. The Rambam, we're jumping in the middle of a conversation of the Rambam, Maimonides. So the Shmona Prakim are his 8 chapters that are an introduction to Pirkei Avos, and really there's like the bedrock of his philosophy is in there. And he talks about a machlokas, a debate that exists between the philosophers, or at least a seeming machlokas between the philosophers and the rabbis, about what is the role of a person in life. Are they supposed to struggle with their baser inclinations on a regular basis, have always a war with their Yetzer Hara, so to speak, and win every battle? Or is it that a person should bring himself to a point by which there's no battle anymore, that the battle's been won, that they never feel a desire to succumb to the Yetzer Hara? The voice is no longer in the back of his head. The red guy's not on his shoulder anymore. So which way is it? So Maimonides says, on the surface, these 2 approaches, that of the philosophers and that of our sages, appear to contradict each other. The philosophers were of the opinion, in general, that a person should strive to feel, align himself with positive virtue, and therefore never have a desire to do something wrong. Whereas the rabbis, there are certain sources that I think we're going to quote here.
You shouldn't say you don't like chazir, you should say...
Yes, that source, right? That says a person shouldn't say, I don't know if we're going to quote it here, I may have quoted it in a previous part of this essay, where the Rambam quotes a Gemara that says a person should not say, pork, pig is disgusting. They're supposed to say, pig looks delicious, cheeseburger looks fantastic. But what can I do? God's not letting me eat it. And I have to listen to my Father in heaven, so that's what I'll do. Right, so it sounds like the rabbis are aligned with the approach of always being at war with your Yetzer Hara, and you should win the battle, hopefully. So he says on the surface, these 2 approaches...
What the thing about the 2 Yuds and the Yetzer, that Bara, Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Ra...
Right, our Yetzer Hara is something we're supposed to value, to be true, right? So on the surface, these 2 approaches, that of the philosophers and that of our sages, appear to contradict each other. This is, however, not true. The Rambam is going to maintain this is not really a machlokas at all. They are both true, and there is no discrepancy between them at all. The explanation is as follows. The qualities that the philosophers deem evil and concerning which they say that a person who has no desire for them is more elevated than one who has a desire, right? Better to not have any Yetzer Hara in these matters at all, but overcomes it. You beat your Yetzer Hara. Right, that when it's evil to just overcome your Yetzer Hara but still have it, are those that all people will appreciate as evil. For example, murder, theft, robbery, cheating, and the like. These are commandments which, even if they had not been recorded in the Torah, it would have been proper to inscribe them. They are referred to by some of the wise men of the later generations who have fallen into the sect of Medabrim, that was a Muslim way of thinking, as rational commandments. There is no doubt that a soul that desires to perform any of these acts, is a soul with depraved qualities. For a refined soul will not desire any of these base things at all, and will not suffer discomfort from holding back from them. In other words, the Rambam says, with regards to the mitzvahs that are rational, the ones that we can understand, the ones that, mold together a society, the things we could have figured out on our own, we're supposed to actually identify with those, and not feel in any way like, I'm not supposed to say, I would really love to murder that guy. That's something I want to do. But God said I'm not supposed to murder, so what can I do? We should not want to murder. We should not want to steal. We shouldn't want to do any of the rational commandments. In contrast, the matters concerning which our sages said that a person who overcomes his natural inclination is greater, and thus earns a greater reward, are for the mitzvahs that require obedience. For in truth, had the Torah not forbidden them, they would not be considered evil at all. For this reason, our sages said that a person should continue to desire them, and should feel that the only thing preventing them is the Torah's decree. So it sounds like, and if you look at that example, which the Rambam quoted earlier, which we mentioned that side of eating ham, of eating non-kosher food, that's something that is a beyond rational mitzvah, supposedly. Right? I can't tell you, at least, there's been reasons that have been given, but it's not something that you and I would have figured out. Oh, it must be God doesn't want us to eat pork. Right? So the Rambam says, when the Chachamim were saying better to desire these things and say, I'm not going to do it, because God told me I can't have it, that's with regards to these mitzvahs that we wouldn't have been able to figure out on our own. Right? For those, we should have a constant battle with our Yetzer Hara, and we should always make sure to win. It's not really a matter of identifying with a disgust of non-kosher food. So we're starting to have the kernel of an answer here, I think, of what freedom is about. It sounds like with regards to at least the rational commandments, it sounds like I'm allowed to identify with these things. These are not things that go against my nature. When Paro whips me and tells me build a giant building and I don't really have any desire to do so, it's not something that I value, so that will be a slavery. And there's no way I'm identifying with that demand. But if I'm dealing with the demands that God makes, so then I can actually begin to identify with them. I'm going to follow them not because I want to do them, but because He said so. But then after He said so, I'm going to identify with Him. It's going to become a part of me. It's going to become what I want to do.
That's like the Pekei Ratzon, make your Ratzon His Ratzon, right?
Right, for sure. And like the Mishnah Navo says. Now we've been using that earlier as a source that I think challenges that concept of freedom. It sounds like you're not supposed to have a Ratzon at all. But I would say, at the end of the day, when you look at the wording of the Mishnah Novos, I still do have a Ratzon. My Ratzon is now aligned. It's identified with that of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's. Right? It's not that I've become a robot and I no longer have thoughts, I no longer have desires, but it's that I identify with them. And that's really, I think, where we might start to see a little bit of an aspect of freedom that can exist within the Torah's commandments. But now we have a problem, though, because the Rambam said there is a realm of commandments that we're not supposed to identify with, that we're not supposed to feel like I'm connected. I don't want to eat pork, right? To keep using his example, right? So tell me, before we go to the next source, even where Rav Lichtenstein asked this question, do you imagine, let's say, a great tzaddik, let's say Rav Moshe Feinstein, do you think, in keeping in line with the Rambam's words, he's supposed to walk by a McDonald's and paste himself to the window and be like, oh, that looks delicious, that cheeseburger?
I don't think so.
So no. I don't imagine him. I don't imagine he ever did do that.
Doesn't even happen to me. So.
Right. So that might be a caricature. It's an extreme example. Do we think, in line with what the Rambam says, that Rav Moshe Feinstein walks by McDonald's and says, cheeseburger looks really good, but God says I'm not supposed to have it. So what could I do? Does that sit well with us?
No.
No? Why not?
There's also a concept you have to make a fence around the Torah.
Oh, so there's Dinei D'Rabbanan, there's fences, right?
Right, to distance yourself so to prevent you.
Mm-hmm.
I can't see Rabbi Moshe Feinstein struggling, having an internal struggle all the time. He accepted a long time ago to align his will with Hashem's will, and then he presumably doesn't struggle with it. He just improves himself.
But the Rambam says there's a whole realm of commandments, the beyond rational ones, that I'm not supposed to identify with, it sounds like. Right? So concerning those, what's going on?
I don't understand. Definitely don't understand.
Earlier days he might have had that, that kind of debate, but over time, as you master yourself and your self-discipline, that he's sort of.
But again, so Yussi has an ideal that there should be no battle, even in those commandments.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's what it sounds like, at least at first, that the Rambam also that the Rambam disagrees with that. It doesn't sit well with anyone in the room, I don't think. Correct? And don't worry, Rav Lichtenstein doesn't like it either, and he's going to tell us to adjust our understanding somewhat. So he says, does this mean that we should all be burning with the lust for bacon and ham, but simply be restrained because it says in the Shulchan Aruch that you shouldn't eat it? Is it really an ideal that we should always pit ourselves against God and then let God win? Or pit, if you will, the biological part of ourselves against our moral and spiritual selves? Should we encourage this sort of constant conflict? I find it, as we do, inconceivable that this is the way we are supposed to live. Rav Lichtenstein thinks we're always supposed to identify with the mitzvah. We are supposed to always view that as something that comes not just from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but also from us. But then, what do you do with what the Rambam says? Sounds like there's a certain aspect of these commandments that I'm not supposed to identify with.
At some point, this one goes beyond free will. It becomes part of one's nature, right? And one doesn't have to struggle with this. It becomes, because the way one's aligned one's will with God's will, one's freed oneself from the burden of this free will and the necessity to make a choice. So I've freed myself from the necessity to make a choice. I don't have to make a choice anymore. I don't have to worry about the bacon and cheese.
So ultimately, yeah, I should with these commandments also, I should align myself with them. It'll take time. It might not be something I come to as naturally. Right. But okay. So ultimately, the ideal for a person should be that if the Shulchan Aruch says don't eat ham, then I should feel revulsion for ham. Okay, that's confirming with what we had assumed. But the question is, what is the basis for that revulsion? If a person feels revulsion towards shrimp or lobster because of some aesthetic consideration, therefore he doesn't eat it. Like the person's worried about trichinosis. Doesn't want to. He thinks for health concerns I'm not supposed to eat these things. So then his not eating it is simply a part of the aesthete in him. However, if a person feels that on aesthetic grounds he could eat it, but now he has reached the point where his revulsion is due to the fact that God has forbidden it. How can I want something that God forbids? Then he has reached a level for which a person should strive. So what we have is now, even with regards to these mitzvos, we are supposed to identify with them in a different way than perhaps the commandments not to murder, not to steal, and things like that. Right? But at the same time, yes, you are going to identify with these things at all. Hopefully, you bring yourself to a point where the McDonald's cheeseburger is not something that's shaykh to you. It's not something that starts to pull you in that direction.
It's just connected it all to, it echoes a little mitzvah and lo mitzvah, who is on the higher level, the one who's...
Right.
It echoes that.
We brought up that source earlier. That was sort of the third source on the sheet, actually. Right? So being a mitzvah is a key component of our identity. Right, and we're going to actually get into how that relates to this notion.
Who's on a higher level? You'd think to say someone who does it of his own is higher, but no, because there's that natural.
That mitzvah, not mitzvah, balancing is really essentially what Rav Yosef brings in the third source. Right? It sounds like what we would have thought maybe naturally is I would have thought that if I do this voluntarily, if it's based purely upon my identification with this mitzvah, and then I practice it's altruistic, it's on a voluntary basis, that would be better. The conclusion of that Gemara is, though, not so. Right? That a person is supposed to feel that God is making me do this, and then I do it. But what Rav Lichtenstein is pointing out is when you're mitzvah, that doesn't mean when you're commanded you have to do this. This is being forced upon you, and you should be unwilling to do it. No, it is forced upon you. That's the reality of it. We are a mitzvah. Rav Yosef is also, right? The Gemara says that blind people are in fact obligated in mitzvahs. So we're obligated. That is the reality. But at the same time, it doesn't deny the fact that we can and should identify with these mitzvahs. So he continues. Rav Lichtenstein says, if one keeps mitzvah because they happen to coincide with his instincts and intuitions, then it is all part of self-fulfillment and not part of avodas Hashem.
Now, isn't this also what we just mentioned, the difference between Maman Har Sinai and Purim? That there was
that's a theme that many bring up with the. We actually talked about this at the pre-Purim program about the idea of a mountain being lifted over our heads. Yes,
there was more like
there's a lot of parallels to that discussion also. Yeah. Right, that's we were forced at that point, and then later on in the Purim story, we've decided we do want to identify with these things as well. But Rav Lichtenstein continues. He says, Avodas Hashem means to serve God for His sake. But once you identify with what God wants, you can then bring your own self-fulfillment to be part of your Avodas Hashem. Right? It starts with God, but then you can bring yourself along for the ride as well. Kant believed that a person must always act against his inclination, but we do not subscribe to this position. Right? Kant was he actually took the view of Chazal to the extreme. You should always be going at war with your Yetzer. Judaism does not want a person to feel like a shmata all his life, constantly fighting himself as if the whole of spiritual existence is to be realized through inner tension and struggle. Certainly, it is both psychologically and religiously beneficial for a person to find happiness and self-fulfillment in what he does. But we grant this on one condition, that the content and direction of that which makes you feel fulfilled did not start with you. It started with God, and through a process which admittedly is difficult, you have been gradually been able to shape your own inner spiritual being in such a way that now there is consonance between what God wants and what you want. And that if we, I think this really touches on, I think at its core, how we can celebrate freedom in light of the fact that later on we get a Torah, we get mitzvahs, we get all these obligations, these things that we have to do, is that ultimately when we came out of Mitzrayim, when we came out of Egypt, we were coming out of a land that out of the clutches of a ruler who was making us do things, and making us do things that were not good for us, that we couldn't possibly identify with, right? When we come to freedom, Yetzias Mitzrayim, we're celebrating that, the releasing of those shackles, of getting out of those things, and that I don't have those obligations. But it's not just a step along the way to Matan Torah where we become slaves to God instead, right? Because ultimately, when we become slaves to God instead, when we have a Ma'amad Har Sinai, when we have all these obligations of Torah mitzvahs imposed upon us, there's a lot of room for us to explore as well. There's the things that we have to do. That again, like we said, it starts with God. We are mitzvah. We are obligated in these things, but then God wants us, and it makes sense to, because He's commanding us things that are actually for our own good, for our own benefit. It makes sense that these things, after you're doing them, you can actually start identifying with them and make them a part of your ratzon as well. And then they can become freely what you want as well, and in a way that makes sense. So that in a nutshell is one of the mitzvahs. That's an approach to mitzvahs. I wanted to talk a little bit about one mitzvah that I think really encapsulates this idea, particularly because it's representative of mitzvahs. It's the mitzvah of tzitzis. I would normally pick a gender-neutral mitzvah, but this one is, it has a certain role in that it actually represents mitzvahs. And Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, in his collected writings, he has a long, one of the entire books is actually based on symbolism in Jewish law. We have a number of mitzvahs that are meant to serve as an oath, that are meant to be symbolic of something, right? Tzitzis is definitely one of them. Before we get into what he actually does with the aspect of tzitzis that I think identifies with what Rav Lichtenstein is saying, is just skip to the last paragraph of his source. The laws of tzitzis require that...
1/3 and 2/3.
Yes, that we're supposed to have 1/3 of knots. Knotted strings should comprise about 1/3 of the length. I might actually be a little... No, if you start from here, I think I have 1/3. And then the other 2/3 are supposed to be the free-flowing strings.
So
right?
The two operative words there are bound and free.
Bound and free, right. And those...
it's like Chavut Alechot and Chirut Alechot. It's the
yes.
same dynamic.
Being bound is something that is going to definitely be symbolic of obligations, of restriction. Right, whereas free-flowing strings are...
I think you mentioned that it's important that the 2/3 is the majority.
That's the paragraph we're going to read right now. So Hirsch says...
How do you think like the writing's German? Gesamte Oh, sorry, I didn't know you were a friend.
So Hirsch says, also we're skipping ahead, we're going to go back in a minute, but he says, also there is more freedom than restraint, more unfolding than restriction. He's quoting a halakha part of the Gemara. The strength of the twisted cord is 1/3, that of the free hanging threads 2/3, right? Rav Hirsch wants to bring out reasons and rationales and explanations of not just the mitzvah as a whole, but also every detail of the mitzvah as well. So this aspect of the mitzvah, of the length, he thinks is crucial. In every sphere of life, more will be permitted by the law than forbidden. We forget that sometimes. We see Jewish life as being very imposing, of halakha being very restrictive. Of course, to one who is overcome by his senses, a single prohibition which forbids him to partake of just one fruit looms so large that he considers all of paradise lost. Right? Some people will see that cheeseburger, will see their Pesach preparations being a little bit overwhelming for a week of their lives, let's say, and they're going to see, this is not freedom. But to the pure human spirit serving God, the forbidden is negligible compared with the abundance of the fruits of paradise granted him by God. First things first, before we get into what the strings actually represent in terms of the mitzvahs, it actually tells us in a more of a behind-the-scenes kind of way, that the tzitzis are meant to represent mitzvahs and show us that they don't play the entirety of the role of man's life. Right? That ultimately, I have a lot more freedom than I think. To say this in a more concrete way, the Torah makes demands of me. We have various mitzvahs, chiyuvim, things we have to do, but there are certain obligations that we have that are limitless by nature. And there are things that we, in your aspects of Torah, Avodah, and Gemilas Chasadim, those 3 pillars of the world, we have demands in all 3 of those spheres in our life. Those are all things that you're supposed to be involved in constantly. But what do you do when you have a demand coming from one perspective telling you, always be involved in Torah, always be involved in Avodah, always be involved in Gemilas Chasadim? I can't do all 3 at once. So what is the obligation then? So Rav Hirsch will tell you, it's the free hanging strings. How do I want to distribute my time? How do I want to distribute my efforts in those realms of my existence, of mitzvah observance? So you have a lot of freedom. You can choose how you want to. There are certain minimums that have to be fulfilled with regards to all 3 of these, perhaps. But in terms of how I'm going to live my life, what's going to be the general framework? What am I going to emphasize? Right? So that's something that you have freedom for, and that really makes the majority of your life things which you have freedom of choice in, with some restriction, with some definition, right, with some structure, but at the same time they are ultimately free-flowing strings. They're things where I have an elective ability to choose how I want to do things and how not to. So that's one important thing to point out. It has nothing to do with what we've been saying until now, but it's just an important symbolism within the mitzvah of tzitzis that I wanted to bring up. And now go back to the beginning of the source. So Rav Hirsch points out, and this is something important to keep in mind, when we talk about tamei ha-mitzvahs, when we talk about garnering the reasons for the mitzvahs, we never, in many ways like a scientist, will never shape the facts to fit his theory, hopefully, if he has some integrity, right? In the same way, we should never take tamei ha-mitzvahs and plug them back in to how to observe the mitzvah. The halachos are givens, so to speak. They are the realities of the world in many ways, that they're givens for a scientist, the things that he observes. And then the rationale for the mitzvah, the way that I identify with the mitzvah afterwards, can come by seeing shades of meaning from the various details of the mitzvah.
I think it's simple. That's why it's called tamei ha. Tam means taste. Taste is like a chesed from Hashem, that like you have to have food that's good for you, and the fact that it tastes good is like a bonus. And that's why it's called tamei mitzvah, because regardless if we understand it or the deeper meaning of that, the mitzvah is good for you, whether we, you know what I mean? And the tam, that's why it's called tam.
For sure. And so it would be, first of all, it would be a big mistake to take what we understand to be the tam of the mitzvah and then plug it back in. I could think of some rare exceptions, but where you plug it back in and actually use it to define the halacha itself. No, the halachos are our givens, but when you do that, also another mistake you might make is that you look at the way people are observing the mitzvah and see that has it brings forth the reason. The problem is when we observe mitzvahs, we also observe rabbinical restrictions that are placed on that mitzvah as well. Right? So rabbinical restrictions aren't necessarily meant to have an influence on the reasoning. Sometimes the rabbinics are really just there to provide a safeguard, to make sure we don't mix things up, right? Like a fence. If that's the case, it has really nothing to do with the essence of the mitzvah, and therefore it shouldn't have any impact on understanding the reason for the mitzvah. Right? We have to always, when we're trying to come to an approach of understanding tamei ha-mitzvahs, of understanding reasons, ways we can identify with the mitzvah, we have to be sure that we understand what is the din d'oraisa, what is the biblical commandment, what is God telling me to do. Right? Forget the rabbis for now. When God tells me to do something, so now I want to understand why He's telling me to do it. So I have to be very clear about what God is telling me as opposed to what the rabbis tell me. So with regards to the biblical law of tzitzis, at least for Ashkenazim, it's a little bit more complicated for Sephardim. For Ashkenazim, the rule is that the strings should be made out of the same material as the garment itself. I'm wearing wool is an exception. Wool happens to be a variety of string that can work for any garment. Right, but so let's say the reason why many people wear wool tzitzis, for example, is because they want to be sure to make sure that their strings are of the same material as their garment. Right, for Sephardim, that's something that might be more crucial. For Ashkenazim, we view it as the strings, if they're the same material as the garment itself, that is a fulfillment of the biblical mitzvah of tzitzis. So Rav Hirsch wants to take that element of the halacha and run with it. So he talks. First of all, we're jumping in the middle, but he says that tzitzis are meant to be representative of the mitzvahs in what way? That our garment is, so to speak, meant to represent ourselves, whereas the strings actually are the outgrowths of us, of our mitzvah observance, the fruits of our labor, the sprouts, as he's using his language. So he says, now examine these sprouts, tzitzis, upon your garment. Although God's law bids you knot them, and knot them firmly to your garment, kasher elyon da'araisa, right? That's also important to know. The various knots that we have here, the only thing that's actually biblical by nature is the first knot to the garment. Everything else is minhag in terms of how you do it. So the first knot is something which God wants us to do. That you knot the strings to the garment, that's something we can draw meaning from. So you have it tied to the garment. They are nevertheless merely threads of the same kind of material as that from which your garment has been woven. Hakanaf min kanaf. That that's the language that Chazal use when describing this mitzvah. The strings are supposed to be of the same min, the same type as the corner of the garment itself. The sole purpose of this commandment is to act as tzitzis, to develop your human nature to the highest level of perfection. It does not seek to accomplish anything else than what is already part of your original vocation as a human being. Its observance does not make you into anything else but a human being at its best, achieving your highest potential as man. Where Rav Hirsch is outside. What he's saying is, I understand from the fact that the strings are supposed to be of the same material as the garment, That's supposed to represent the fact that when I do mitzvahs, they are supposed to come from me, from who I are. They're an extension of me. They're not a foreign material being imposed on me. Mitzvahs are not something which is, something that's supposed to make me into a robot. That is something that I don't identify with. It's supposed to come from you. Now, these sprouts to be attached to your garment are both entwined, restrained, and loose. They are bound together at the base, but then allowed to hang freely beyond that point. Emanating from this bundle are sprouts that are allowed to hang loose. It is from the restraint that the free threads flow. Right? It's important. It's not that tzitzis are free-flowing strings and then knots at the end. Right? The opposite. We start with the knots, and they progress into the free-flowing strings. All the sprouts and forces that lie dormant within the human being should indeed develop and attain full bloom. That's what our free-flowing strings will be, but not without controls. That which is to become tzitzis must first have been gedil. You have to start with the knots. This very submission makes the highest form of freedom attainable. The idea conveyed by its threads is not restraint from the outside, but self-restraint. That even those laws, even those things that bind you, that provide you with the groundwork by which you can then express yourself, those are also going to come to some degree from us. They're going to be things that we identify with. It is not an alien extraneous bond that binds these threads which emanate from man's garment. Man is to restrain himself of his own free will and to adapt himself with all his own energies to a higher order. And that's where we come into that idea of bechira, as we mentioned. Free will is something important because even the bindings, even the strings which that represent my being chained down, my being having commandments imposed on me, those are coming from me. Those are coming from free will. They're coming from the same material as the garment itself, and then from there I can develop, and I have plenty of room, as we saw in the last paragraph, to develop with that, to move on, and to identify with the commandments. There's a lot that I can do there. And then most importantly, and this is where I think we really can understand the freedom when we talk about leaving Egypt. We do have our own personal desires, how we identify with the commandments. They have expression with the system that God gave us. When we talk about the various things that are imposed on us, but then we can and should identify with them, that means that we have freedom in that respect. That we have the ability to buy in and make this a part of us being something that we want to do as well. And although Paro would love for us to want to build, pyramids for him, I don't think we built the pyramids, but whatever Paro wants us to do, it's not something we can conceivably identify with. Right?
Well, why did you say we didn't build the pyramid?
A conversation for later.
Yeah.
Whereas what God tells us to do, Rav Hirsch says, it builds us into a perfect human being. And because of that, because these are actually things which we should want, therefore we can want them, we can identify with them, and therefore when we're doing them, not just out of bechira chafshis, not just that I'm choosing to do these observances because God wants me to, but I'm also choosing to do them because later on, after I accept that I'm doing them because He tells me to, I identify with them. These are a part of me now. They become hakanat min kanat. They become that the strings are made of the same material as my garment. That the actions that I do are actually in consonance with what I want personally and internally.
That's interesting. Kanat on the bird is exactly what we said.
The wing.
It's part of an outgrowth of the rest of the body of the bird.
When we talk about a wing, I think the etymologically probably very very much connected, right? That it's an outgrowth of the main aspect of a person. So in terms of understanding freedom, when you're cleaning for Pesach, or doing whatever observances that are very overwhelming during this time of year, and observance in general, it should by no means be viewed as a contradiction to freedom, because hopefully, it starts with feeling like I have to do this, right? But hopefully, as we're going through these things, we're learning about them, we're learning why we do these things, and we're able to identify with them and make them that they're no longer just things I do because God is making me do them. That's not freedom, but that a person brings themselves to a point where they identify and achieve self-fulfillment through these things in a way that makes sense, in a way that we actually appreciate. And then you could have both freedom and a feeling of ana avdekuchabrichu, that I am a slave to God, that those can actually work in consonance with each other. And it could have a meaningful Pesach and a meaningful Shavuos as well. So thank you very much for coming.
You also see that the word yetzer and tsar, like Mitzrayim comes from tsar.
Mitzrayim restriction.
Yetzer, creativity, and
there's a lot of deeper linguistic themes we could develop here as well. Yeah.
But creativity comes out of restriction. Like if you can just write a poem, like when you're restricted by beat and meter and haiku and all that, then the true creativity comes out by having those back. If you're just wild, and that's why Paro is just wild. Parua.
A violin string, if it's just
right,
it's not going to do anything.
Only when it's
by being bound on two ends, then it can produce a beautiful sound in the same way. Okay.
Right.
Thank you very much.